So what do we have? From the beginning, many domains affected, not one. It's not general, it's still selective, but many domains, not one. Now, this picture is very consistent with the way childhood neurologic disorders present. We never see a single primary deficit. We always see a constellation of deficits that reflects the underlying cause. If it were a stroke, the deficits would be in the distribution of a blood vessel. If it's a head injury, it's in the distribution of the blow to the head and then the blow to the back of the head, brain inside the skull. Now, the next thing that we know from neurology is that impairments present when the time in development comes for those functions to emerge, and then they don't. Children with dyslexia were born with the genes that cause that dyslexia. But you don't know that until they can't read. Although if you look at them early, many will have language delay. Now, what was happening in these infant sibs in the brain? About 9 months of age, there was that deceleration and plateauing of brain growth. So there was an abnormality. Too much brain growth early, and then a deceleration and sort of an arrest in development. Once again, that speaks to all of those events that are going on in the brain in terms of development of connections. And for neurologists and developmental neurobiologists, where a neurologic syndrome just arises for no apparent reason, they affect one of these areas. And, in autism we have 3. Neuronal organization for sure. Neuronal migration, meaning the brain cells getting to where they're supposed to be in the cortex. And then the number, neuronal proliferation, that one you'll see in the extreme preemies. About a third of them develop autism spectrum disorder because the neurons that were heading for the cortex lie in the area of ischemia when an extreme preemie has a stroke. So let's look at what goes on in this one category of events in the later parts of pregnancy. Here's what's happening to the brain. Notice you have the basic shape of all the structures at 15 weeks, and as you move on, the surface of the brain begins to develop the sulci, or the infoldings, that increase the surface area. As neurons arrive, there's only one place to go, and to expand the surface area, that's what happens. These are the events that are going on. These are from 25 to 32 weeks. You can see that the neurons, which didn't have very many connections at 25 weeks, are getting more at 27 weeks and have a lot more at 32 weeks. Here's postnatal, 1 month, 6 months, 24 months. Where's the cause of autism? It's the events going on in the brain that you don't see, but that medicine knows are going on. And if you have an error in the code, genetic code for this, it's like having a time bomb. You don't know you have it until it goes off. The same thing, of course, can be said for multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, many of the epilepsies. We don't know what our genes carry. I was listening to the BBC several weeks ago, and one of their scientists said, in a sense, every disorder could be considered a disorder of the genome, except for the car accidents and things like that. And the reason they say that is because we are dependent on that same DNA to maintain and grow the structure of the brain throughout our lives, to repair it as we get older. And many of the diseases are where this breaks down. And another level. So those were the issues, and that was the evidence that pointed a way of thinking of autism as a disorder of neuronal organization and a couple of other areas, and I'll put a finer point on that. Now, were the infant siblings the first time that we heard about multiple domains being affected at the same time? And the answer is no. We and a number of others did studies a long time ago in high-functioning adolescents and adults looking at function across various domains. And what resulted was impairments in what we call higher cortical sensory perception. We test that. If you have somebody close their eyes, write a number on their fingertip. If your eyes are closed, the integration in the cortex allows you to say what that number is or put an object in their hand. Complex motor or skilled motor deficits. Memory deficits. We had a paper on memory deficits in autism, and it took 3 years to get it published because it wasn't in DSM. It was in the brain, though. It's really using organizing strategies to enhance memory. It's not amnesia at all. And then higher order language, story recall, idioms, metaphors. Can they form concepts? And then one surprise was face recognition. The reason it was a surprise is that everything else said distributed in the connections among brain regions. But face recognition is often a focal brain abnormality. 10 years later, we know that face recognition is also a distributed function, so that's probably how it all goes together. Now, what the profile meant was basic abilities, cognitive and neurologic abilities were intact or enhanced, but they had a limitation on the capacity to process information. And the more complex or the more information or the faster you had to do it, that is where there was a constraint. And so this was one of our first fMRIs, and the control group is on the left. This is a left hemisphere task, but it's visually presented. So you see a lot of activation on the lower part, which is the back of the brain. But importantly, you see activation at the top of the slide in the frontal areas in the control group, but not the group with autism. And 10, 15 years later, that's exactly the replication we've seen, regardless of what task we're looking at, is reliance on visual areas more than typical people, and underdevelopment of access to frontal cortex, those longer range connections.